So today, it's 4-link day. You can see this truck's obviously got some issues where it's got this permanent lean going on here, where it kind of just runs downhill sideways. It's mostly due to the springs in the back, those old leaf springs with that, I don't know, that easy ride flex shackle thing on the back. The shackles are super bound up on the passenger side here, and so it like keeps the spring more forward and shoved around in a place that you don't want it. So this truck's been on the lift for a while, and the suspension's been hanging down underneath. I'm assuming if you drove the truck a little bit, it would kind of settle out some and those springs would kind of let go, but everything's super rusty and super locked up back there. So instead of just replacing springs and hangers, we're going to cut all that stuff out, knock all the rivets off, and put an actual Outcast Customs 4-link setup underneath here. So the cool part about the Outcast system is it's actually set up to run the Ford Explorer 8.8 under the back of these old F100s, and it all bolts in. Minus a few brackets that kind of weld to the axle. So I couldn't find a whole lot of instructions online as far as step-by-step, which piece goes where, how to do what. So my hope with this video is that as I install it, we'll kind of make an instructional video. So anybody else that buys that kit will have a cool step-by-step instruction that kind of shows you what all the pieces are, where they go, and how to install them. I'll definitely be sure to show you guys any sort of measurements or anything that I take as I go along, and that way you guys can copy this as well and use it as a guide for your own installation of one of these Outcast Customs 4-link kits. So with that, I'll go ahead and pull the bed off this truck and we can get a better look at the back of it. So here's the kit as it comes in the mail from Outcast Customs. So the way I did this is I ordered the Panhard bar, I ordered the 4-link setup with the specified valved and springed Viking coilovers, just to make this a complete bolt-in kit. So total, I think to the door, this whole kit was $1,680, which is a pretty good value in my opinion versus other systems I'd looked at to do this. Stuff was over $2,000. I guess you could maybe make it yourself and try to save some money that way, but for a bolt-in kit that was this nicely finished, this seemed like a really cool way to go. So here's the Panhard bar setup. Comes with a really nice finished bar. They just welded a end into the bar there again. So super nice welding as usual from Outcast Customs, and got a nice threaded adjustable end in it there. And there's one of those on both ends. There's a bracket to bolt it to the frame, and there's an accessory bracket that goes to it. So once it welds on the axle, tube this way, accessory bracket goes over, and it gives you a nice joint for your Panhard bar to sit in here and go over to that frame tie. And we'll go over how all this stuff fits. But as usual, the fit and finish from these guys is absolutely fantastic. The welds are perfect. And then afterwards they go through a media blast of things. So this thing's ready to drop off at the powder coater as it shows up in the mail. Of course, this piece is welded onto the axle, so you probably don't want to powder coat this piece, but you could powder coat the whole axle afterwards if you wanted to, I guess, or just paint it. The nice part is you don't have to media blast it, it's ready to just go. And there's the 4-link setup here. So there's 2 frame brackets and there's 2 axle brackets to make all this tie together. So the brackets with a half circle cut out in them are the 2 axle brackets. One of them's going to weld to the axle, the other one's going to bolt over as a cover and give you a nice place to tie those 4-link bars into and attach them to that axle. There's the frame brackets here. Again, everything. So these will just bolt to the frame with these 4 holes on the side and give you the adjustability to put your 4-link bars wherever you want to. Again, fit and finish, the welds, the media blasting on the metal afterwards, absolutely phenomenal from these guys. So really nice work, really nice thick heavy steel too. This isn't some simple little cheap from China bolt-in kit. These guys are obviously making a quality product, and they obviously care. Miscellaneous coilover brackets that actually allow the coilover to bolt to the frame and to the back of the axle bracket. We'll go over all these and specifically how to install each one of them. And it comes with 4 bags of hardware. Well, mine did because I ordered the 4-link bar kit, the coilovers, and the Panhard bar. So I guess whichever kit you order, you can break it up however you want to. They come with the respective hardware for each piece. So again, you can look in the bag, you can see tons of nice grade 8 hardware, all nice finished castellated pieces, not just a bunch of cheap stuff with a universal Allen key sort of bolt together overseas stuff that you typically see. The link bars here, so this stuff actually comes from several different manufacturers. The link bars actually come from a different supplier, so these ship separately. Again, super high quality stuff where you can tell people have spent taken a lot of pride in the way stuff goes together, the fit and finish, the nice machine chamfers on the inside edges of the link bars here, the super nice welds. You can see great heat penetration. The opposite end has got a adjustable link in it, and nice part about this, so they've done that. Again, super high end, nice precise welds around here. Definitely nice quality stuff. The link bars come with all the necessary plastic bushings and inserts to go here. Again, everything seems like it's nice high quality stuff. The Viking coilovers come with a nice 200-pound spring. And then you get the actual coilover body itself, and it has adjustable compression and rebound adjustments on it. These are really nice index knobs, and it should make for some super quick adjustments. Just climb underneath the truck and make a couple of quick turns, and you're back to testing out your new setup. So that will start the work. So here's a good shot that kind of shows you the difference in the two springs. You can see the spring shackle here in the back, or the, whatever you call this little pivot piece, is pointing forward at almost like a 45-degree angle towards the cab. And then if you look over here on this side, where the spring's actually articulating and working, it's straight up at like 90 degrees. And same thing when I jump on it, you can see this one pivot back and forth quite a bit. And this one is just like bound up like crazy. I don't really understand what the problem is with it, why it won't fold back. Maybe it's just rusted shut, that sort of stuff. So the problem with this is it can cause you to have an inaccurate axle center line. So if one of your springs is down and the other one's up, well, these spring shackles being forward as much as this one is, and now being straight up and down, this spring on the passenger side is actually pushed forward more than the spring on the driver's side. So it's actually making the axle sit underneath the truck cockeyed. So these old suspensions are pretty worn out. If you just leave them where they're at and mark the center lines and reset the axle back where it is, you might end up setting your truck up with an axle that's not square to the frame. So even though it's kind of a pain to go through and double check and measure them, I always use a couple of holes in the frame here, make sure they're good and square with the frame first, and then go ahead and make sure your axle center line is square off of those holes. So I'm going to do that now. So with this axle here, had I just dropped a plumb bob on it and said, yep, it looks like my center line is about where I want it, you know, I'd be way forward of where the axle actually needs to sit. And so one of two things could have happened. I could have put the 4-link bar in and set the axle up to where this side of the 4-link was half an inch further forward than the driver's side is. I might have ended up with an axle that actually doesn't center itself in the frame pocket here that I have cut out. And so then I either have to move this frame pocket, or I just have a useless frame pocket because the axle comes up and hits it anyways. So the axle center line marked and the thing up on jack stands and sitting nice and level, I'm going to go ahead and pull the rear axle and the rear springs out of this thing. It's pretty self-explanatory, so let's cue the fast forward motion. Alright, so these axles have quite a few unnecessary brackets on them if you're going to use the 4-link. So the spring bracket on the bottom down here is going to come off because the 4-link needs to go around there. There's a top control arm bracket on the Ford Explorer. We're not going to use this bracket, so I'm going to cut it off. There's a, I think it's a shock bracket or something on this side that goes just above where the pinion flange is here. So this can come off and go away, and same on the other side. So this will clean things up quite a bit. So the downside of doing this is that it actually loses or removes these little brackets that hold the brake lines up. So I'll have to come back at the end and put on some sort of little bracketry to mount the brake lines here, and then on the opposite spring perch as well. The other option is to either leave or remove this sway bar, and if you're going to remove it, you might as well just take the brackets off with it, kind of give you a cooler look. I'm actually going to leave the sway bar on this truck, so I'm going to leave the sway bar brackets welded and mounted right in place here. So to remove these extra brackets on the ends that I don't need, I'm just going to use the plasma cutter and then a flap disc and get that stuff out of there. You could use a cutoff wheel, you could probably use some sort of like Sawzall, any number of things to remove those if you need to. Wow, that was a horrible mess. Just cutting those welding bosses off of there on the top and bottom side, just put that powderized dust everywhere all over the floor. So if you guys are going to do this at your house, I'd say take this one outside and do it, because it is awful. But you can see it cleaned them up real well. They're gone. Just use that flap disc, that rough 40 grit on the grinder. And the bottom spring perch is gone too. So now you get a nice surface here to clean up and weld those brackets to for the 4-link system. So at this point, I'll put this axle on the jack, I'll put it back on the truck and get the 4-link out and get the 4-link assembled and try to get this thing set in place. At this point, I've got the axle exactly where I want it. I've got the center line set, I've got it squared up side to side, and side to side I just took a measurement from the back side of the brake caliper mount. So it's not the brake caliper, because the brake caliper can actually move in and out. This dust shield is actually flexible, and so it can actually bend back and forth. The nice square piece here is the back side of the caliper mount. So I just took a measurement from there to the actual frame. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and put this 4-link system together and get it actually mocked in place and just held on with some clamps real quick. So step 1 here, I'm just going to put these bushings and these inserts into the ends of these link arms, and that'll get all these parts put together. So generally when I do these, like put these bushings onto these link arms or suspension components, you're putting a lift kit on a truck or a lowering kit. I typically use this silicone paste and just put a little bit of silicone on there. These bushings look like they're already coated with a little bit of silicone anyways. Step 2 is going to be mocking this 4-link in place. So the kit comes with the hardware. So first off, this kit comes with the assorted hardware you need. It comes with 4 shorter bolts, which will go forward on the forward link bar mounts. And the longer hardware actually goes through the link bars. The shorter ones, again, go on the front, and then the longer bolts are going to go on the back where the link bars tie to the axle brackets. So here you have your axle brackets. This is going to go on the back side of the axle, and then these clamp bars or clamp brackets are going to come from the front and actually sandwich in this way and actually surround the whole axle. And you have the forward link mounts, which are going to actually tie to the frame on this flat side here. This will sit against the frame rail, and these are side specific, so you have the left side, right side, and this pocket here will open back towards the axle, the link bar to plug in and actually articulate up and down here. And as luck would have it, of course I put my jack stand right here where I thought it would be out of the way. And it's right in the center where I need to line this thing up to. So make a quick adjustment here and get on with things. At this point, things are mucked up, set in place. The link bars are all set to the same length, and they're all set in place. The assortment of jack stands is certainly a friend in this situation, trying to clamp these brackets to the frame in any way or put a tack weld on there just really complicates things. So a jack stand's nice because you can kind of slide it laterally back and forth on the link bar here. As the link bar runs up and downhill, it'll actually raise and lower this bracket for you slightly. So what I did is took a square and put a square on the frame and went along and measured the distance from the top of this bracket to the frame to make sure everything was nice and square. So I set the same measurement on both sides. So I went ahead and went 1 5/8 inches down from the top of the frame rail to the top of this bracket. And it seems like it's going to let the link arm sit as close to parallel as possible when the truck is sitting at about ride height here. So on this truck, I'm going for about a 5.5 inch stroke, and that should be about where my ride height's going to be for the back of this thing. So now that I'm confident that I have these brackets mocked up and squared where I want them, I'm going to go ahead and mark the holes in the frame, punch the holes out, and mount these brackets to the frame so they're nice and securely mounted. At this point, holes are drilled, and go ahead and put your bracket back in place. I actually bolt it to the frame where it goes. And now we're ready to turn our attention to putting these brackets onto the axles and getting our first tack bolts put on here. So pinion angle on this truck, with the way the truck's sitting right now, the transmission is sitting at about an 88.5 to 89 degree angle. So I'm going to do is just take my angle meter I've got stuck on the pinion flange of the axle and to set that to 89 degrees as well, so it matches the transmission angle. So at this point, I'm just going to go through and double check my measurements and make sure my axle side to side distance is exactly where it's supposed to be. I'm going to go through and make sure my brackets, where they actually weld to the axle, are actually the same exact distance from the back of the brake caliper mount bracket to the inside edge of the bracket, just to make sure they're perfectly square and even on both sides. And that'll ensure a nice square bind-free fit as this thing floats around back here and operates. So like I said before, I'm going to set my axle from frame distance at 9.5 inches. So I'm about 1/8 of an inch off on this side, just I'm messing with a little bit. Ooh, almost perfect. So I double and triple checked my measurements, make sure my bar was nice and parallel to the frame all the way down. Again, to ensure it's not going to have any sort of binding issues, it should move nice and freely. I got my axle center line set exactly where I want it. So the axle set dead center side to side. And then I got my pinion angle set in line with the transmission up front. So now that I'm sure everything's nice and square, I ended up having to take a clamp here and clamp this walk bracket from the front to the back and let it pivot on the bottom bolt, so it actually comes around the axle and then sandwiches the thing together. So by using a clamp, it pulled the bracket nice and tight to the axle, so I'm just going to leave it clamped up while I got it where I want it, put a couple good tacks on it and tack this thing in place. So kind of a mess everywhere here, but you can at least get the idea of how it's going to work. So I pull the jack stands out from underneath the axle, and then the brackets are just tacked in place. Then we can actually see the articulation, how much it lets that axle move back and forth independently. So obviously needs a Panhard bar put in place, but always super cool to see the 4-link get bolted to the truck and then see it pivot up and down like that. So we've got some more work to do on the sway bar mounts. The sway bar mounts in the axle are actually hitting the frame here. So you can see that this bracket is going to have to swing down below the axle or something. So I'm going to have to actually come in and cut these sway bar mounts off the axle and relocate them. Because on both sides they tuck right up inside of this new frame pocket that we made here. But that shouldn't be too big of an issue. But right now I want to go ahead and put the coilovers in this thing so this truck will actually sit on its own weight. And I can put the tires back on it and actually have this thing rollable where I can move it around the shop again. So Outcast teamed up with Viking coilovers like we talked about before. So the coilovers show up in a box and they require a little bit of assembly here. The hardware you get with the kit, the Outcast kit, is actually pretty simple. There's a stack of shorter bolts and there's 4 longer bolts. And there's 4 brackets. And the brackets are a pair per side, so each side gets a long bracket and a short bracket. So I'm going to set these aside now. And then obviously the bolts are the same way, half and half. So this longer bracket is actually going to mount on the bottom of the axle bracket. So we're just going to take 2 of these short bolts and bolt this right down here to the bottom of the axle. So the nice part is this gives you a little bit of adjustability. If you want to raise the truck a little bit, you can use a pair of these holes that are higher up in the bracket, and they'll actually push the bottom of the coilover higher, which will in turn push the truck frame up in the air this way. I want this truck to be as low as possible, so I'm going to drop this bracket all the way down. In the top bracket, it's got 2 holes on the frame side and then just a through hole where the shock actually is going to mount. But to figure out where this is going to go, we want to put the coilovers together first. So these coilovers come with some pretty nice hardware. They come with these 2 Heim joints, which have a nice pivoting action here. And these go through the eyelets on top and bottom. So these just slide through the bottom, and the problem is that these will just slide all the way through. So what Viking's done is give you a set of circlips, just these spring-loaded circlips that mount or clip into these recesses in the bottom of the actual shock body here. The easiest way to do this, take your spanner pliers and just put the spanner ring in the shock body on one side. Drop the Heim joint through the side that doesn't have the spanner ring in it. And then put a spanner ring in this gap here. So there's one end complete, and I'll do the same thing on the opposite end. So now you put the spring on here. There's paperwork that comes all inside the box that says, caution, caution, put anti-seize on these threads before adjusting the ride height. So we're just going to assemble these loosely. So I'm going to put just a couple of drops of oil in here just to make sure there's no binding or galling. And before I do the final install and go through and set ride height on the truck, I'll definitely put some anti-seize on these bodies here. So first goes on this lock ring, and it has a little feature, a little brazed boss on the top of it. So that goes up. And then the spring catch piece, or the spring retainer piece, goes on again with the spring retainer cut out facing up, because the spring's going to slide over it. There's a metal ring. Mine happens to be bent, which I think will be okay. The spring should straighten it out. That just slips on over the recess here as a slip joint to make sure that that spring doesn't dig into that aluminum ring at all. Again, a couple drops of oil here just to make sure that we're not going to have any issues with this thing galling up or anything. Just for a quick assembly test fit. So now this ring's almost all the way down as far as I can get it, just to make putting the spring keeper on as easy as possible. At this point, the 200-pound spring goes on. I'm just going to put this on so that these letters in the Viking spring are legible. So put them on right side up. I don't think it matters how this spring goes. I think both sides are flat on the coil and it's fine. There's a spring retainer piece here with a cutout in it to slide over the actual shock shaft. And so essentially with all your body weight on there, you can actually compress that spring enough to get that keeper underneath the top of the retainer. At this point, I'm just going to raise the lower spring adjuster here just enough to put tension on the top of this spring. And then with the bolts that were provided in the kit, the bolt, as it goes to the eyelet on the bottom, is actually too sloppy. You can probably see better from this angle here how much movement there is in there. The nice part is they give you two reducer sleeves to actually just slide in here, which fits super nice, and reduce that fitting diameter down to one that actually fits the bolt really nicely. So that done, go ahead and put the coilover in the mount. I'm going to mount it with the adjustment knobs out towards the back. So that way, whenever you want to make adjustments to it, all you got to do is slide underneath the back of the truck and make a few turns, and then you're back on the road again. So now, it's going to mount these top coilover brackets to the frame. Just a bolt that goes through top of the body, and there's two holes in the bracket. They're going to mount to the frame. So here's the tricky part with these. The bed actually sits up off the frame a little bit here. And you're going to say, well, how much does it stick up? How do I know how much it sticks up? I don't really know. It's a good question. Luckily, on this truck, we have a way to cheat. So someone was courteous enough to put in these gooseneck mounting plates and a couple of giant heavy pieces of angle iron here between the frame rails. So these pieces of angle iron come up and sit right on the bottom of the bed floor. So we know the bottom underside of the bed is at this height. So I got a piece of extra angle iron laying around. I'll lay this on top. We know that the bed floor is this high off the frame. So right now it looks like the top of this shock's sitting a little bit too high. I'm looking at probably a ½ inch or so. So I think what I'm going to do at this point is drop the axle down about a ½ inch. And we're back after that brief commercial break. So now we've got these two, our piece of angle iron is sitting just over the top of this coilover. So we now know almost exactly how high we can mount this bracket here. And for those of you guys paying attention at home, if I try to square this bracket up as best I can with the frame to make sure the shock is sitting exactly perpendicular to the frame, it doesn't have any weird angles happening or anything. Let's see. And I'm right at 1.1 inches off the frame. So the coilover mounts, the upper ones, I ended up welding those in place because the gooseneck mount that these guys had put in this truck before a long time ago and just welded those big pieces of angle iron in across the frame there, ended up being right in the way from where I needed to drill holes in the frame and mount those upper coilover mounts. So the downside is that if I ever wanted to go back and adjust that coilover mount and make it lower or taller or something in the future, it's going to make it real tough to go do that. But anyway, those are in, ready to go. So now we got to get the Panhard bar going. Alright, Outcast Customs Panhard bar kit. This is the stuff that comes with it. You get a bag of hardware, which is all the stuff you see laid out here. Obviously a Panhard bar, and then a bracket. So the bracket's going to let us mount the Panhard bar to the frame. The two holes in the back are going to attach to the passenger side of the frame. And then this gives us two options to mount the Panhard bar either close into the frame rail or further out towards the drive shaft. It's a two-part bracket here. This actually is going to weld to the axle next to the pumpkin, and it's going to give us a place again to tie our Panhard bar in with a bolt here. So one of these large bolts is just going to go through this section that when the clamps come together here, this little plug in this hole, and give us a place to tie that heim joint in. So really nice heim joint hardware for each side of this, and then these spherical joints that go through here on each side to make sure that this thing can pivot around and be nice and free of any sort of binding or anything. So pretty cool kit, pretty simple to install, it looks like. Alright, so I'm going to try to mock this thing up without making a mess, without dropping parts over the place on camera. We'll see how well that works out. Okay, so this Panhard bar looks like it would normally fit against the outside frame rail here. But the way I've got it set up with these boxed in C-notches here, looks like I'm going to have a little bit of a issue to contend with. So I'm probably just going to mount this to this inside of the C-notch here and then try to mount. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this axle back out of the truck just to make it a little bit easier to work with here. So while I had it out of the truck, I went ahead and removed the brakes and the brake line and then the emergency brake cables. That stuff was just getting all over the place and it was causing interference, making it hard to move the axle around, like one of those cables would get stuck under a tire and pull the axle off a jack or something. So that's out of the way temporarily. My next issue, as we saw with it going up and down in that test fit there, was that these sway bar perches are actually hitting the underside of the C-notches here in the frame. So my plan is, I still want to run a sway bar on this thing, and I think the factory one's probably fine to start with. I'll probably upgrade sway bars in the future. But as far as getting the truck on the road right now, just the factory Explorer rear sway bar should be just fine for this. So I'm going to do, instead of trying to find new perches and trying to weld new perches on and everything else, I'm going to take the plasma cutter and cut these perches off and try to retain the arc that's in them and then just move them down underneath the axle. I'll get this thing cleaned up and get the plasma out and try to make some careful cuts and just pull these sway bar perches off of the axle and set them aside for right now. Alright, so let's come off of there and look like they're at least usable again. So I'll just put those down below the axle once I get the axle back in the truck and then weld these back in place. We got them someplace where they're out of the way and ready to go. Here's the axle all cleaned up. Got those brackets cut off, got those welds ground down. Ford put some big old fat welds on those perches. Anytime they put a spring perch on or they put a sway bar perch on, man, they really just stack the welds on there. It takes forever to get that stuff ground off. We got it ground off and got it cleaned up. The tube's nice and smooth now, all the way around. So it gives me a nice place, one, to mount that Panhard bar bracket to the axle tube, and then actually somewhere underneath here put those sway bar brackets or sway bar perches back on the bottom of the axle after I step it back in the truck. So I'm going to get the jack out here and put this axle back underneath the truck, hopefully just one last time. Well, that was more of a delay than I was wanting, but I think it's going to pay off for me. So, axle's cleaned up now. I think I got a nice place I can weld to on not only the Panhard bar mount, but the two sway bar perches. So I think I'm going to have to go with kind of a non-traditional install of this this Panhard bar, and so I got the Panhard bar set as short as I can make it, and I'm using the short hole on this side where it actually is supposed to bolt to the frame. Well, with this C-notch kit I have, it's actually blocking the frame from where I want to put this this Panhard mount actually inside the frame there. Mine also has this this gooseneck or fifth wheel plate welded in between the two frame rails. I think what I'm going to do is just weld this actually in place. So I'm going to weld the bracket to this C-notch piece that I have here. So before I tack weld this Panhard bar in, I want to make sure I set it as level as possible. So this is the truck sitting at ride height here. So the springs are in place and the weight is essentially on the wheels. So the weight is on two jack stands here. There are no more jack stands under the frame. The weight is on the front tires and on the 2 points in the back axle. So it essentially has the full load on the back axle here. So this is right where it should ride. And so the idea is you want the Panhard bar to be as level as possible the majority of the time. So if the truck's going to naturally sit at this height here, that's perfect, that's where we want it. So what we're going to do is set that Panhard bar level. So if you kind of excuse my rough Google SketchUp animation here, we have the axle and then the Panhard bar actually attached to it here. So what we're looking at is this Panhard bar and setting it as close to level as we can, right? So what happens here is this Panhard bar actually moves in an arc like this. So what that does is causes the whole axle, when it goes up and down, to essentially follow that same arc. So the axle, instead of going up and down like it normally would with leaf springs, this axle, this is kind of over exaggerated, but it moves under the frame in this direction. So the closer we can have that Panhard bar set to level, the more it allows that axle to move up and down in a straight line here as it passes the center point, versus having it down here where it just wants to move this way all the time underneath the truck. So that's the importance of keeping that Panhard bar as close to level as we can during the normal ride height of the truck. And as long as the truck's level, we can go ahead and set the Panhard bar to level, and we'll just tack it in place like that. Alright, so that bar's just tacked in place now, but now we can actually kind of see how this thing's going to function. So as it goes down, and it comes back up, and you can see right there that this bracket that holds the Panhard bar in place is actually hitting this piece of angle on it sitting right here. So it's going to stop the axle from going all the way up into the C channel. So what I'm going to do is just take the plasma and just notch this section out here so that it stops interfering with the articulation and the movement of this axle. So that Panhard bar's tacked in there. It's looking real nice and level. Last step here, actually attaching this sway bar to the bottom of the axle. So what I've done is used a bunch of jack stands to hold this thing in place, otherwise it was hard to manage and wanted to fall down. So what I'm trying to do is make sure it's perfectly centered side to side, and that my link bars are going to be in a place where I can probably shorten them a little bit and then tie them into the frame. So got like 3 or 4 jack stands, the axle is sitting on 2 jack stands and the weight of the truck's on it, so it's at ride height. So I'm going to try to set it to where it's pretty level and rides in a pretty neutral place while it's at 0 load or at ride height. And that way, if it takes corners and turns, it should do its job and keep one side of the vehicle up and the other side down, and etc. and so forth, how this sway bar works. So what I'm going to do is essentially make sure I'm dead center side to side here, and then make sure these sway bar perches are nice and square to the axle and tack them in place. So as long as they're tacked in place, I'm going to call it good enough. So all I want to do here is just tack these perches in place, make sure they're nice, equal distance from the outsides of the axle, and make sure the sway bar is being held in place good and centered and isn't off center and causing the axle to ride funny or anything. So I'm just going to hold it up. So a little bit of fresh rust encapsulator paint just to clean all the rust and junk off of this thing and get all those bare steel parts painted up so they don't rust. I just painted those with some Tractor Supply, like black enamel tractor paint, and hung up and painted them. So Gonna go ahead and bolt it all together for hopefully one last time here. Make sure I torque everything down and make sure it all goes together how it's supposed to. Well, here it is, post-final assembly. Brake lines are hooked up. It's got some new rotors on it. Everything's all locked down like it should be. I went ahead and painted those 4 Explorer brake calipers red just to make sure they'll stop faster than your dad's Corvette. Everything's tightened up, painted, assembled, new brake pads installed. Everything's torqued down real well. I'll kind of show you guys just a few little issues I ran into and what I did to solve some of these problems we talked about earlier. So to secure the brake line brackets here, I just drilled and tapped a hole for a 1/4 20 thread bolt right in this axle bracket that comes with the kit. And that made those brake lines nice and secure. They're clear of any sort of interference with the spring or anything. So everything's set to go there. I did have to bend the factory brake line a little bit just to make it all fit around these new larger axle brackets that come with the Outcast kit. So I tied the drive shaft back into this truck and started hooking up brake lines, fuel lines, that sort of stuff here. So everything about this kit seems like it's absolutely awesome. It looks like it's super heavy duty. It all lines up well. It bolts up well. It just works with these trucks. So definitely have to recommend it. And I'm super excited to get to drive this thing. So I'm working on getting a video done for this rear fuel tank conversion. I actually did video it. I just don't have it all finalized and edited yet. So I hope you guys found this video useful. Hope you found it entertaining. Hopefully you can apply it to something else or to, just installing this Outcast Autoworks kit yourself on your own vehicle. And you guys have any questions or anything, go ahead and drop them in the comment section below. I try to check comments like every other day and respond, and so I try to share links to all the parts that I use and all the tools that I use if I have anything special or crazy that I've run into, just so you guys can see where to buy that stuff yourself. Okay, that'll about do it for this one. See you guys in the next episode.